The Liberal Democrats have been seen since 2015 as a bit of an electoral joke. A party that stands for nothing, perhaps falls for everything, has been nothing more than an anti-Brexit protest vote. But is that changing? Viewers might have seen the amusing spectacle of Lib Dem leader Sir Ed Davey on telly, knocking down some blue bricks with a tiny, ickle-wickle orange hammer. Not quite Boris Johnson in his Get Brexit Done digger, but we get the point that Sir Ed is trying to make on what appears to be a vanishingly small budget. But putting that to one side, is Sir Ed right? Does this shock, stunning victory of overturning a 16,000 majority in a seat that's always voted Conservative mean that the Liberal Democrats are back in business? Could they be about to do to the so-called blue wall what the Conservative Party is doing to the so-called red wall? Well, joining me to discuss is a lifelong Lib Dem who says he isn't celebrating the revival of the Liberal Democrats' fortunes. Nick Tyrone is a former director of Centre Forum, described as the closest thing the Liberal Democrats have had to a think tank. It's considered to be responsible for the Orange Book, which would serve, in my eyes at least, as the text that allowed the Liberal Democrats to be seen as serious enough to be a party of government, which it would go on to do from 2010 to 2015. Nick's author of several books, including Politics is Murder. His latest, The Patient, is out in September, and he also does a fantastic column in the Spectator, which you should all check out because, of course, that magazine is phenomenal. Nick, hello to you.
Hello, Darren.
Now, as a lifelong Lib Dem, Nick, I want to know this. This seems like the obvious first question. Why are you not absolutely jubilant? Why are you not positively beside yourself with excitement?
Well, I should state that I was a member for about 10 years, and then I very quietly let my membership slide around 2016, but always with a kind of hope that I might rejoin the fold at some point, that something would happen. My big problem with the way that they won the by-election was just that I just feel like running against planning liberalization, I think that's one of the most, if not the most liberal thing I think this government is seeking to do. So I just couldn't support that really. Although I will say that I think upon reflection, I think it's part of a wider strategy that the Lib Dems are going to employ. And it probably it might work, which will be interesting to talk out. So basically, the liberal in me hated it, but the political strategy nerd in me sort of couldn't help but think maybe they're onto something.
So, I mean, does it, in given that what you've just said, does this by-election actually prove then that the party is more than, because some have argued, perhaps unfairly in your eyes, that having briefly tasted power between 2010 and 2015, the Lib Dems have now just sort of reconciled themselves to be nothing more than an outlet for local protest, which surely is what Chesham and Amersham ultimately was, or is it something bigger than that?
Well, I don't think it's I don't think it's a return to Lib Dems trying to be party of government. But I think actually what they've understood is the parameters of where they are. So I think they've basically come up with a strategy. So actually, going back a little bit, I think there are probably three reasons why this happened that are plausible. One is it was just a bizarre black swan event that happens sometimes, particularly in by-elections. I think the second is this some part of a kind of anti-Tory movement or something that could be coalescing mostly around the Lib Dems, but we could see it with other parties who are sort of seen as quote-unquote progressive. But the third, which I think is the most likely, is that this is part of a strategy that Ed Davey and his people have put together that I think actually, again, even though I don't like it as a liberal, could be possibly their best shot at electoral relevance. And when I say electoral relevance, we're really only talking, say, like 30 seats, 35 seats. But actually, considering where the Lib Dems are now, that would be pretty huge. So I think the three strands of the strategy, I sort of was thinking about this all this week, and I sort of think about it as a sort of like, it's like the Lib Dem political strategy sandwich, really. So it's got three elements to it. sort of like the meat of it, which is the thing that none of it would work without. But then you've actually got two slices of bread either side, which kind of are still important because they stick it all together. So basically, the meat of it is running on the NIMBYism, basically, as we saw in Chesham and Amersham, and we saw how well it worked. And I think they probably are.
That's anti-house building, right? Standing against house building, yeah.
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard, yeah.
You might support house building somewhere that wasn't where you live, but where you live, you will find all sorts of reasons to be against it, which actually be interesting to come back to, because I think that's actually an interesting point, because it really shakes out what the Lib Dems are doing. But anyway, they've decided to run on this focusing on probably most of these seats in the southeast, where this NIMBYism sort of strategy can be exploited. So that's the meat of it. I think the two sort of pieces of bread that hold it together, one of which is, and when they did it at the time, I was a bit confused, but it's slightly not rolling back from their anti-Brexit positioning, but distancing themselves a little bit, sort of almost kind of giving out a message of, well, we haven't really changed our minds on this, but we're going to shut up about it. We're not going to go on and on about it, which I sort of thought was confusing at the time, because as much as, okay, you could say, well, Brexit's done. Where is there any mileage in that? Etc. At least it was something. At least they had a constituency, and they sort of seem to kind of go, well, forget about it. But actually, I think it really works well for the kind of sort of southeast NIMBYs that they're going to be targeting, simply because I think a lot of them will be Remainers, or soft Remainers, is how I would put it. So they probably voted Remain in 2016. If there was another referendum, they might vote Remain again. But we've had 5 years of it. They're sick of it. They don't, they're going to be turned off by a party going on and on about it, basically.
Yeah.
Well, actually, in retrospect, I think that was quite smart, given that this was a strategy, and also makes me think that this has been part of a strategy. They've thought about this for a while. I think the other one is just as important, though. The other sort of piece of bread, which sort of sticks this sandwich together, which is, and Ed Davey was questioned on two major things after the by-election result, and one of which was this all about planning an HS2, which he obviously tried to say, no, it wasn't. It was whatever. But the other one was, does this represent the start of a sort of progressive alliance? Will you be teaming up with Labour and the Greens and whoever else to create, to basically to as a sort of anti-Tory almost electoral pact? And I was interested that Ed really he really distanced himself from that. He even went as far as to say, the voters don't want to stitch up. Because actually, I think that the more that they kind of became seen as part of this whole progressive alliance thing, I think that actually more than anything might have destroyed this electoral strategy, because it's an easy thing for the Tories to run against. They can say, look, you might be voting for the Lib Dems because you don't like planning, you don't like house building, whatever else, but be aware that this isn't a free shot. Actually, when you're voting for the Lib Dems, you're voting for a Labour, Lib Dem, SNP, stick it all, rainbow coalition. And by the way, have you seen what they've been saying? They want to change the voting system so that they can basically stitch it up, stay in power forever, an electoral dictatorship of the left, And I think that could scare enough people that at a general election, that sort of destroys the Lib Dem strategy. So actually him distancing himself from that, I think, is quite intelligent.
So that's where the Lib Dems are at. That's where the thinking's at on all of this. That makes sense. I can get that, because of course historically the Southeast has been ripe pickings, hasn't it, for the Liberal Democrats? And of course, I think you're right that it's sensible to distance themselves, as far as electoral purposes are concerned at least, from the idea of this alliance type thing, because it has put off voters. It did it in 2015. It did it, you can argue, to a certain extent at least, in 2017 in certain seats, although Theresa May, of course, nearly lost the election. And in 2019, I think, as far as a coalition to get Brexit done, right? That was a sort of winning slogan, the anthem of 2019. But if we consider, though, there is no other viable way. There doesn't seem to be a viable route to government for the Labour Party without forming a coalition, at least at the moment. I'm not saying that can't change. Of course it can. But right now, can you really trust the Lib Dems, given what happened in 2010? This idea that they won't get into government with Labour. Do you think that will sort of hang over the electorate's head when it comes to a general election as opposed to a by-election?
I think that's a great question. I think there's lots of things to think about with the general election. I think a big one with general elections is, we saw this in 2019, the Lib Dems tend to get squeezed by the two big parties because people go to the polls in a general election to elect a government, right? And if you know the Lib Dems are going to form a government, actually that's a big incentive not to vote for them, regardless of anything else. And I think actually, given what happened with the coalition, 2010 to 2015, we saw that actually a lot of people who voted for the Lib Dems probably were unhappy with that government. They sort of built themselves on, votes that I think for some extent, lots of people like that government, but lots of people who probably voted Lib Dem in 2010 didn't want that as a government. So I think that's something that always hangs over you. I mean, I think that, but then you've got, the problem is that it's a sort of double-edged sword, because then if you say, well, actually we're not going to go into government with anyone, we're basically just a protest vote.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a reason not to vote Lib Dem. So what do? Do you say, as soon as you say, well, we would think about going into government, and then that means, well, who? Well, okay, if you wouldn't go into government with the Tories, that automatically means you'd go into government with Labour, which then again just sets up the Tories' anti-progressive alliance, messaging. But then if you say, we won't go into government with anyone whatsoever, that might damage you as well, because again, what's the point?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're interesting points. I want to turn now away from house building and coalition building to perhaps intersectionality, which is perhaps even more controversial than trying to get planning permission these days. Because if I and I think you know this, I voted Lib Dem before. I used to be a member of the party. When my sort of political awakening came around the same time as the same-sex marriage debate, which of course Lynn Featherstone and Lib Dem, they're highly responsible for much of the legislation, etc., etc. Back then, I sort of thought, well, I'm a liberal because, I believe in gay rights and all the rest of it. I quite like the idea of gay people getting married. I happen to believe marriage is an important institution, blah, blah, blah. And the Tories, as going back to as far as the 1980s are concerned, the Tories weren't much of a home for gay men and women, right? They were still wedded to the idea of Section 28 until Cameron, sort of before, not in my lifetime, basically. Now, everyone seems to be fighting at the moment for a sort of slice of the electoral rainbow. And I wonder what your answer is to the sort of, where do homeless liberals, and I mean small L, where do they go right now when it doesn't really seem like the Liberal Democrats are actually standing up for what I would deem to be classical liberal values? Instead, they're obsessed with identity politics. The trans women are women debate seems to be one they go back to time and time again. Where is the sort of party for those who just say, enough is enough with this? I just want to go back to, yeah, of course, let people do what they want to do. But I'm not sure that the Lib Dems are actually a bastion of classically liberal values anymore. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, that makes perfect sense. In fact, I'd almost go further in a sense, which is that this was, I think, the day after the by-election, and there was a Lib Dem activist on Radio 4 he'd campaigned. He lived in the area and he'd campaigned for the Lib Dems. And it was interesting at one point, he then started to go on this whole thing about how, well, we need a radical redistribution of wealth in this country. We need to basically a sort of, I don't think this is putting it too strong, a slightly Marxist kind of.
Oh, right. Okay.
Like it was, and I think actually there's a huge element of that in the Lib Dems activist camp. Like there's lots of people, and this goes way back because actually there was lots of people who didn't feel like New Labour was left-wing enough for them. And so they actually joined the Lib Dems as a sort of left-wing alternative. And this has been a big thing, I think, within the Lib Dems for ages and ages. It kind of goes back to that whole Orange Book thing. Like, is the party trying to be a sort of roughly classical liberal party, socially and economically liberal? Let's just define it as such. Or are they a party of the left? Are they a progressive quote unquote party. And I think it's interesting that they do have this. I think one of the big things that's going to be difficult for Ed Davey is if he wants to pursue this, this strategy that we talked about, where does he then start to get pushback from the activist space who are like, well, why aren't we talking about, radical redistribution of wealth? Why aren't we talking about, why aren't we? I think there's a dream within some Lib Dems to sort of take over the mantle of the Labour Party as a sort of party of the left, but not by becoming the Liberal Party and that being the sort of answer to the Conservatives, but actually like becoming, in a sense, almost a more radical version of the Labour Party, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, but I mean, do you therefore then think that modern day Liberals understand that, and I don't mean to sound patronising when I say that, but understand that intersectionality isn't actually liberal?
Well, I've written a bit on this, and and actually, David Gauck had said something. I can't remember what outlet, but he'd written something about, where did he think the Lib Dems could build on this? And one of it was, be socially liberal but not woke. And he made the point that I think that was very good and I truly believe this. I think one of the things that really hurt the Lib Dems in 2019. I mean, I think the ship had slightly sunk by then, to be fair, but I don't think it was helped by the week of the election, Joe Swinson going on the trans women are women, kind of going on the radio and going. I just think that
was Radio 4. Yeah,
that was I think that was really quite harmful for them because again, a lot of people who are, they're people who probably have voted Tory. They're not socially conservative, but they're people who probably would have been completely fine with gay marriage, etc. But I don't think they realize outside of their activist base how controversial some of the trans activism stuff can be, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's a real problem in terms of Lib Dems trying to reach this particular audience who isn't going to like that, but you've got an activist base that's pretty woke, really. So how do you reconcile that? How long? I guess if you can maybe if there's a whole bunch of by-elections in the southeast, you can keep that train running because victory is its own kind of reward in some senses. But I would worry about that if I was Ed Davey. I think it's a really big thing for the Lib Dem leadership to think about.
And I feel like the threads that I'm sort of grabbing and piecing together from everything you've said in what almost 20 minutes. The fact of the matter is that the Lib Dems seem to be trying to be which has always been the problem for the Lib Dems. Yeah. It was a problem when they became a party of government, right? Where they're trying to be something, everything to everyone. Where, in the south, in places like Chesham and Amersham, where people have got absolutely gorgeous houses, Nick. They've got beautiful homes on the end of the Metropolitan line so they can still get into London. Beautiful houses. Of course people don't want a house built in Bonanza there because they've got it good. Yeah. Where if you compare somewhere where the Lib Dems traditionally could win as well, like there are areas in Leeds, for example, Sheffield, of course, where people do want housing, even parts of London, of course, people do want housing.
Yeah.
How do you square that? And again, I'm piecing together the same strands where you've said the activist base wants the party to go hardline on, if you don't believe trans women are women, you're a TERF, you're a transphobe, blah, blah, blah. And then sort of what I would deem to be your average voter saying, oh, hang on a minute, this sounds all a bit too radical and intersectionalist for me. Yeah. I don't like that. I don't like what you're saying about this. Men in prisons with women, that sounds a bit, that's scary stuff. So how do they marry all of these different positions that they seem to be setting out at the minute?
Well, the other one is actually on the economic scale. How do they set out? You've got
exactly taxes,
Chesham and Amersham who are well off, okay? And again, we can get them because if they run on this NIMBYism thing and we don't want house building, and we were sort of soft Remainers like you, there's a vote there for them, right? But again, it's not really what the activists want. If you've got an activist base that wants to be radical in terms of redistribution, who are in some ways like sort of soft Marxists, if that makes sense. They're they would never use the word socialist. They would never self-apply the term socialist. But in a sense, that's if you look at what they want, that's pretty much what they are. I mean, they'd sort of be on the left of Labour. Like, they would be Corbynistas. They wouldn't be sort of even the soft left of Labour. They'd be the hard left in some instances. And so with that and the sort of the woke stuff, how long can Ed keep that whole ship running? Is a very good question. I don't know. What I would say, though, is, again, the lessons of the coalition are, if you sort of try and ride both horses, eventually, at some point, you make a choice, and you're going to upset a lot of people, and you might destroy your entire electoral coalition that you've just spent, however, 10, 20 years building. So I think the problem, again, the problem with their current strategy is, by any definition, it's short term. But yeah. I guess I could probably say, well, anything that they're going to do is riddled with problems. I mean, they're really in quite a bad electoral bind, Lib Dems. I mean, they're very close to being totally irrelevant, really, and actually having nowhere to go. So, yeah, the strategy has loads of problems with it. But I sort of think, well, anything they would try and do is going to have those problems. And Ed has a lot of leeway as a leader, right? He doesn't have to go on the radio in the general election, 3 days before a general election or whatever it was, and say trans women are women. He can just avoid the topic. He can push it aside. He can just not talk about that stuff, which, as far as I can tell, I haven't seen him talking about it. So I think he understands, actually.
But Sir Ed Davey doesn't strike me as the sort of politician that would want to go out of his way to talk about that sort of thing. I think he's more sort of, his element is wind turbines over trans activism, I think.
Yes, exactly. And so I think that's to their benefit. I think that the one thing I can say about the Lib Dem membership, as left-leaning as it is in some senses, I think there was probably a sense in electing Ed Davey over Layla. Because I think with Layla,
you would get it, yeah.
You get a lot of that. And also she'd be leaning in massively on all the woke stuff, and also on the Progressive Alliance stuff. She'd be really leaning into that. And I think that would have been, all of that as a combination just would have been totally disastrous. Because basically they would be chasing an electorate that they just won't go for the Lib Dems. They just aren't interested in Lib Dems. People like that, why would they vote for the Lib Dems, who were in party with the Tories for 5 years, when they could either vote Labour, or if they really just can't stand Labour for whatever reason, vote Green, who have a totally clean skin on this stuff and have the same sort of values, but much more clearly defined. And again, without the baggage of having been in government with the Tories for 5 years. So I think that whole strategy would have been a hiding to nothing. I think, I really think they could have got completely wiped out at the next general election. As it stands, it's a big question how they can do it.
It is a big question. It is. But what explains then this sort of Marxist undercurrent of the sort of activist class within the Lib Dems? Because if you consider the Lib Dem, the history of the sort of merger of the SDP and the Liberal Party, do you think it sort of comes from this? Because my understanding or my experience of the party, at least over modern times, because I would have last attended a Lib Dem party conference in, I think, 2015. Okay. Well, maybe it was 2014. I can't remember now. I'm getting old. And the Liberal Democrats, I never joined in with singing songs like Tony Blair should F off and die, which is what some of the Liberal Democrats actually do. People won't believe me watching this right now, but this happens.
The Glee Club. So at the end of every Lib Dem conference, there's something called Glee Club, where you show up and everybody has song sheets. You're given song sheets, and the lyrics are basically the different lyrics to well-known songs, so that everybody can obviously sing along without. You don't have to learn a tune. You just have to sing along to the words, and it is Tony Blair should F off and die. A lot of the songbook is really about New Labour, actually, because
that's the question I wanted to ask, though. Does that explain it? Is it just, we are to the left of New Labour. We probably agree with the Corbynista activists, actually, that Sir Keir Starmer is more to the right of where I'd like to be, personally. And that explains the sort of Lib Dems bind, where they're wanting to sort of adopt a position that is probably more to the right of the activist base?
Well, it's an ongoing problem, I think, for
Yeah.
most leaders, you know. So Ed Davey, in that sense, isn't probably that different from Nick Clegg, although he probably doesn't want to hear that. But I think that's probably true. And I think the Lib Dem activist base being very left-wing, I think it really just comes from that new Labour period, where a lot of lefties joined the Lib Dems because they didn't like Tony Blair. It was about Iraq. It was about the sort of perceived authoritarianism of New Labour, or the idea that Labour had swung massively economically to the right. Which, if you're a Corbynista, you could see how you would think that, I guess. Yeah. And I think that's really the sort of same mentality. Although what's interesting is how much semantics come into all this, because in the Labour, you can go to Labour conference and you can have Labour MPs who are firmly on the right of the party, who will say, well, as a socialist, and I'm speaking as a socialist, and you just think, how are you a socialist? I don't understand how you're a socialist at all. What do you mean? You're not a socialist. If you look at anything that you've ever done, the things that you champion, your voting record, all down the line, there's no way that you're a socialist by any textbook definition. And yet in the Lib Dems, you have people who would never, ever, again, never self-define as socialists. And if you call them that, they'd be terribly insulted. And yet, actually, that's kind of where their beliefs sit, is really, on the far left, on everything. Like not just economically, not just about wealth redistribution, but like about nationalization, about even all the cultural stuff that's fairly new, all the woke stuff that we were talking about. They're just firmly there. As to what they think about Starmer, I mean, the interesting thing was when Starmer got elected, I think a lot of Lib Dems were very warm towards Starmer and thought, oh, this is great. And there's a kind of a slight myth that exists that it does have some truth to it, but I think it's sort of become not true, which is that the Lib Dems can only do well when Labour does well, right? And where that comes from is the fact that Lib Dems tend to beat the Tories. Where their traditional seats were, they were always Lib Tory marginals. It was really rare that Lib Dems took seats off Labour in significant numbers. So there was this idea, well, we need Labour to do well and the Tories to do badly. And I could see, that certainly was the case in 97 and 2001. A big reason the Lib Dems could jump to 46 seats from 20 and then keep growing was because the Tory vote was so down throughout that whole period. However, I think we've actually come to a point where things have turned a little bit. And I think actually one of the big ways that the Lib Dems could do well at the next general election is if Labour are perceived to have no chance at winning. So if, let's say, Boris calls an election in 2023, they're on the Tories are on 48%, Labour are on 28 or something, then I think that actually helps the Lib Dems. Because they can say in a believable way, look, Labour aren't going to win. You don't need to worry. It's really a choice between a sort of Tory supermajority, where they have a Blair-like majority, or it's slightly, slimmed down and hey, on stuff like planning, etc. Don't you want them to have some rebels who might cause them problems, and as opposed to just giving Boris a blank check to do whatever he wants and he'll pave over the southeast. I mean, you could really run with that if you're the Lib Dems. So I think actually Labour, and in terms of what's going on in their ranks with Starmer, I mean, I think Starmer's whole stock has fallen dramatically over the last 6 months. Yes. Really fascinating how much his stock has fallen. And I think a big one for Lib Dems in particular, and a certain amount of the Labour activist base, was voting for the Brexit deal. So I think there was this sort of idea of, okay, well, Starmer won't talk about Brexit, but wink, wink, we kind of know, he's Mr. Remain, and maybe that will be, there'll be some sort of soft progressive alliance, and maybe that'll reverse Brexit or whatever. And then Starmer basically voting for it and then saying, well, I wouldn't even renegotiate the deal. I wouldn't even touch it. So even nothing. I think a lot of just over time, a lot of Lib Dems have gone, well, maybe Starmer isn't our guy. So I think that's probably hurt Starmer as well, that feeling. But having said that, I still think a lot of Lib Dem activists are very I mean, I'm only going by what's online and what I see on stuff like Lib Dem Voice and all that kind of stuff. But I still get the sense a lot of Lib Dem activists are very progressive alliance-y. They're still very, progressive. Like, they would really love to see a sort of a Labour Lib, like a Lab Lib government. I think is kind of a dream still for a lot of them.
Yeah. Oh no, totally. I think that must be right.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something there which leads me quite neatly onto my next question, which is, given where we are today, we're 5 years on from the Brexit referendum. Do you worry that perhaps there's a problem with the sort of bollocks to Brexit mantra continuing? People still holding out maybe for that sort of progressive alliance to reverse Brexit and take us back into the EU. Do you think that wing of the Liberal Democrats have made it pretty difficult, if not impossible, for the Lib Dems to sort of reclaim liberal internationalism through the Global Britain brand?
It's an interesting question. The question is, I don't really know. I mean, part of the problem is seeing what happens over the next 5 years. But, I mean, the problem with the Global Britain stuff is a lot of it's very free trade, free market. And if you're a group of sort of socialists in all but name, are you going to like that stuff? I mean, the fact of the matter is you probably aren't, right? And I just think with the activist base, I don't see the Lib Dem activist base ever being anything but like vehemently anti-Brexit. I think whatever happened, like it wouldn't matter. It just wouldn't matter. Wouldn't matter what happened. Because actually, a lot of the Brexit stuff. I think the interesting thing about the Brexit debate is, I think there's a sort of hardcore Remainer that really does love the EU and loves membership. But weirdly, I'm not really sure that that's the majority of it. Like, I think it was really fascinating to me how many of them were so easily sort of after the general election, right? Were so easily kind of led into the Progressive Alliance. Let's go for proportional representation. Like, they were just easy to like. It's like we just need how much of it was really about the EU at all, and how much of it was just we hate the Tories, and the Tories are pro Brexit, so we hate Brexit. And I think like there's people who would deny to their last breath that was the case, but if you look at the sort of the fervor of some of the FBPE types and stuff. It was amazing how much that it wasn't really like, it was less about Brexit. It was more about how much they hate the Tories, really. Like, okay, here's one. Here's a classic example. This will never ever happen, but I'm doing it as an intellectual exercise. So let's say Boris decides he doesn't want to be prime minister anymore. The Tories get a new leader. Okay, on day one of their leadership, again, this is funny because it's never going to happen, but just imagine for a moment. Okay, says, you know what? I think we made a mistake. Leaving the EU was a terrible error. I am going to legislate to rejoin the single market and the customs union as soon as possible, with a view to rejoining within the next 5 years. And again, will never, ever, 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 ever happen. But just imagine for a moment. What I wonder is, particularly with Labour's Brexit positioning, and even the Lib Dems to some extent, who have distanced themselves, how many of the hardcore Remainers would suddenly go, you know what, actually, well, this is the most important thing for me, so I'm just going to become a Tory. I've now thrown in my bunch with the Tories. Almost none of them would. Almost none of them would, I think. Actually, it's a sort of, as much as they shout about it, I think for a lot of them it's kind of a side issue. It's much like if the Tories it became a Remain party, they still wouldn't like the Tories.
Yeah.
I think kind of. I mean, to me, that sort of says something intellectually, which is just how much of this is really just about we just will dislike whatever Boris Johnson dislikes, we'll dislike, whatever Boris Johnson likes, we'll dislike.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. On the sort of point of if we consider the alliance again, were there to be a coalition with Labour in, say, I don't know, 2025? What do you reckon activists would be saying? Oh, well, look at what the bloody Lib Dems have allowed to happen, as they did after the coalition years. What would be the tuition fees? Do you think that could actually be planning reform? People saying, where are my houses? You promised to build me some sodding houses. Or indeed in Chesham and Amersham, people saying, there have been houses built near me. You said this wouldn't happen. What would be this sort of the block for the Lib Dems, do you think?
I think the comparison with the tuition fees is apt. Because in a sense, it's like, well, we're running on this thing because it's a thing we can run on. And we're not really thinking about being in government and having to actually do what we're saying, right? We are presenting ourselves as a protest vote. And then suddenly you're in government, and you've got to decide, okay, well, who are we going to annoy here? Or are we going to annoy our base, which is the NIMBYs, or are we going to realize, well, actually, we didn't really want to do this anyway. We always realized this was a bit silly, and obviously, if we were going to end up in government, we weren't really going to do this. Come on, like what? Get rid of all tuition fees. Come on, that's just silly. Not build any houses. How stupid is that? It's actually very similar, and the only thing that stops me from thinking that that's in any way a realistic scenario is actually trying to imagine a Lib-Leb coalition, which is really, really quite difficult to sort of get your head around. But if I can bridge that gap in reality, that would be completely where the problem the Lib Dems could face is actually just and loads of things. Like, so for instance, they vote for the Lib Dems. So let's say the Lib Dems get like 40 seats, okay, across the southeast. And it's a close election. Somehow the Labour it's like a 2017 reversed, right? So like 2017 again, but actually even worse, right? So you have the Tories starting out really huge, Labour look down and out. So everybody just sort of votes Labour with a kind of free hand. They don't think, well, Labour aren't going to win. And basically somehow Labour and the Lib Dems can stitch together some majority with, I don't know, the SNP is not as part of the coalition, but, sort of supplying confidence. And instantly, the Lib Dems would be, in so many ways, they would annoy this coalition that they put together in the southeast. Because, like Labour would probably put up taxes, they probably put up taxes exactly on those people. So suddenly you voted Lib Dem thinking, well, I'm going to get this great thing. And because I'm annoyed with Boris Johnson for whatever reason, and suddenly you've just completely stung yourself. And then actually at the next election, all those people are going to go back to voting Tory again, because you'd have exactly what you had in 2015. All the people who voted the way they did in 2010 had a certain expectation, which then got completely blown out of the water, and so then it's just like a repeat of the same sort of story.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I mean, I wouldn't like to be Ed Davey right now, I'll tell you that much. But finally, I guess, Nick, we've covered quite a lot of ground. So a fun one to end, I think.
Yeah.
If you were Lib Dem leader, if you were Ed Davey, what 3 policies do you think could make the Liberals great again? Make the Liberals liberal again? And what 3 policies would you ditch?
Ooh, wow. Yeah, that's a wow. That's a tough one. That's a really, really tough one. So 3 policies. I think this is less a specific policy than I think you need to become the Lib Dems. I would make them basically the party of small and medium business. That would be a big thing that I would do. And I just don't see, one of the things that's always frustrated me about the Lib Dems is just whenever they try and do pro-business stuff, it's a total car crash. It's just really, really bad. They're really, they can never actually kind of bring themselves to do it. So whenever they do business policy, it's always like, here's 8 things the Lib Dems would do and it's all painted as pro-business. And you're going, this is some more regulation. This is some more tax. Let's just support. Where is the fine? Even if you had 6 sticks and 2 carrots, I guess that would be something. But there's no, you just guys, if you're trying to compete with the Tories on this stuff, you're forget it, right? So that's what I would try and do. I would really try and be a sort of free market. I'd try and have a whole host of free market stuff that really was more appealing to small and medium business as opposed to just the corporate stuff, because I think that's kind of a way in that you could do. If you can really communicate that you're for the small and medium, so cutting corporation tax for companies under a certain, there's ways you can do it under a certain employee headcount, under a certain turnover. that kind of stuff. So that's definitely something I would do. I would make the party a sort of absolute, like, look, this is an economically liberal party, no ifs, ands, or buts. And important to say, not libertarian. I'm not saying go full on libertarian, because I think that's just too difficult a space to occupy. You're for levels of social democracy, but you're a pro business party. So that's one for sure. Another one that I would go for.
Would you build houses?
Yes, I would build houses. That's an easy one to go for. It might be strategically wrong, and I've perfectly said that the NIMBYism thing I get, and that maybe it's. But if I was Lib Dem, somehow I'm finding myself Lib Dem leader, right? I'm going to go, do you know what? Maybe this party just dies under me. But while I'm here, I'm going to go for it. I'm just going to go for it. And you know what? We're going to build houses, and we are fully behind the planning reforms. And, this country needs houses, so let's build them. And maybe if you wanted to come at that from the left a little bit, you could say, maybe we'll push the Tories to build more affordable housing, more so. You can put pressure on the Tories at that end of things. But that'd be another big one that I would do. One I might try and do is, because you've sort of got the anti-Brexit branding. One of the things I would try and do is be the party of coastal towns. Mm-hmm. So you can say, actually, you've got a kind of opening to say, and you don't have to go full on anti-Brexit, because I think that would be a mistake. But you can kind of say what Starmer is. Starmer doesn't want to touch anything because he feels like the Labour brand's been so damaged by opposing Brexit. So he wants to run a mile from it. The Lib Dems could probably afford to be less in that way, and could say, well, look at the fishermen got a bad deal. We would do better by fishermen, and you'd have to have a whole raft of policies that sort of did that. But that's one way I think strategically I might try and go, because I think that's probably a soft vote all round. Because you saw it with UKIP to some extent. Actually, if you really pay attention to coastal towns, I think someone could do something well there. I think someone could do something better than I think we've seen so far, and certainly what Labour and the Tories are doing at the moment. Mm-hmm. So those are what three would I ditch? It's a wealth of stuff to ditch. Like everything? No. Oh God, there's so much bad stuff in there. Like, oh God, like the last Lib Dem conference was just like, it was like, guys, you should not be talking about this stuff. Why are you talking about this stuff? Why are you even focusing on it? It was brilliant. I'd said something to like some activists online. I said, where are the sort of bread and butter policies? Why is that not being discussed at Lib Dem conference? And one very honest activist said, well, maybe the party just doesn't have any good bread and butter policies. To which you kind of say, well, that's honest, at least. I would follow David Gauck's advice about the socially liberal but not woke stuff. Mm-hmm. Again, what I would do is I wouldn't go to town on it. I wouldn't talk. Basically, I would just be like, let's just shut up about this. Yeah, it doesn't turn anyone on. And actually, even us taking really hard kind of anti-woke stances will probably turn people off. Let's just shut up about it. Anybody who wants to talk about this, let's try and figure out a way to just not talk about it at all. So that'd be one. I don't know how much of this stuff is still actually active Lib Dem policy, but all of Layla's education stuff would go completely in the bin. That would go right in the bin. Because it's all about, because that actually hit home, because I've got 3 kids, 2 of which are school age, 1 who's in nursery. And, all this stuff about, like, well, we don't want any teaching, we don't want any testing at all. Like this kind of idea of school is they just go and it's a safe environment. And if they learn stuff, well, okay. But, otherwise, do we really want kids being rigorously tested? And obviously that's going to make the kids who do badly feel bad. When actually, it's actually good to understand, the smart kids should probably have attention given to them for that. The kids who are struggling, whatever they're struggling with, they need special attention. Like, the last thing that I think we need is just more kind of blob homogenization in education, where everybody's just treated exactly the same and no one, and where you just we've already got enough of that, where the
sort of one size fits all.
One size fits all, exactly. Where the smart kids are sort of just end up really bored.
Yeah.
And the kids who might have learning disabilities, or they might just have, they might have difficulties in some areas, falling way behind and just feeling really frustrated. So the education stuff, gone.
Last one.
Last one. Geez.
Would you ditch Sir Ed Davey? You're leader at this point.
I'm leader at this point. No, I wouldn't, actually.
Right.
Because I sort of think at heart Ed's a liberal. I could be totally wrong about that, but it's worth remembering, and he hates it being brought up, so I will. He was he had a chapter in the Orange Book.
Yeah.
He used to be one of the Orange Book. He used to be like, a prominent Orange Booker. And I still think he's got some of that in him. I mean, I might be doing a kind of Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader thing here, but I think Ed could be brought back to the light.
Yeah, he's not exactly Jeremy Brown, but he'll do, is basically your position.
Basically, that's it's a good summary of the situation.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for giving up your time today. I think you've sort of healthily summarised where the Lib Dems are at, which is basically not up shit creek without a paddle, but not as bad as it was this time, 2 years ago?
Well, certainly, I mean, they'll get a lot of mileage out of the by-election victory.
Yeah.
And, even if they did it in a way that I would never have wanted, that I just don't particularly like, good on them, given where they were. No one, and to not just win, but win by 8,000 votes, it's pretty impressive. So, yeah, they're in a much better position. The real question is just, again, how can they repeat it at a general election?
Yeah.
And
yeah,
who knows?
Well, time will tell. Thank you very much, Nick. If people want to find out more about you, where can they do so?
So all my books are available. Amazon's probably the easiest place, but if you don't like Amazon, there's Waterstones, and all the major booksellers have all my books. The latest one's The Patient, as you mentioned, which is actually about medicalization, medicalization run wild. So I think to some people in the COVID age that might be interesting. But also I write regularly for the Spectator. I've got my own website, which is www.nicktyrone.com, so it's very easy. And obviously I'm on Twitter at Nicholas Tyrone. So that's where you can find me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Now, I'm sure you'll be absolutely desperate to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Leave us a comment below to let us know what you thought. Do you think the Lib Dems are coming back? Is this it? Where the sort of orange government is about right around the corner? Let's see, eh? I don't think so, but hey ho. See you next time. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.